So you sit down in the boardroom, you crack open this brand new compliance framework, and you're probably expecting like a dense wall of impenetrable legal jargon.
Oh, absolutely. That's usually how these things go.
Yeah, but instead, the very first question the document asks you is literally, who am I?
It's wild. It completely defies every expectation we have for a standard, architectural blueprint of a legal document.
Right.
It honestly borders on the existential.
It really does.
Yeah.
And I want to warmly welcome you, our listener, to today's custom deep dive, because we know exactly why you're here.
Yeah, you are staring down the barrel of a highly daunting compliance meeting.
Exactly. Like maybe later this week or honestly, maybe even later today. And you've got this Digital Personal Data Protection Act, the DPDPA framework, just sitting on your desk.
Looming over you.
Looming, exactly. So our mission over the next little while is to basically navigate this really specific compliance assessment and classification questionnaire that's provided in your notes, step by step.
Because the goal here is that when you walk into that boardroom, you aren't just, mindlessly quoting text from a slide.
Right. You actually need to understand the underlying mechanics of the rules.
Yeah, because memorizing a compliance framework is ultimately completely useless if you don't grasp the logic it's attempting to enforce.
Makes sense.
And what's fascinating here is that compliance isn't just about ticking boxes on a spreadsheet. It's an exercise in absolute rigorous self-awareness.
Wow.
I mean, you cannot possibly follow the rules until you define exactly what entity you are in the broader data ecosystem.
Okay, let's unpack this because, sitting in a corporate office with a highlighter while a document literally asks you, who am I? It feels like you should be on a therapist's couch, not in a boardroom.
It really does sound like therapy.
But the framework, it quickly moves from that profound philosophy into concrete operational identities.
Yeah.
Right away, it forces a fundamental split.
Yes, a strict fork in the road right at the start.
You basically have to decide, am I a data fiduciary or a data processor? And to help you, our listener, visualize the stakes here before your meeting, let's look at this through the lens of a restaurant.
I love that. A structural analogy works perfectly for this foundational binary.
So if you are the data fiduciary, you are the restaurant owner. You're the one deciding what goes on the menu, what ingredients need to be sourced, and the ultimate purpose of the business.
Right. You dictate the why and the how the data, or in this case, the ingredients, are collected.
Exactly. But if you are the data processor, you're the line chef in the back. You're just chopping the onions.
Just following the recipe.
Yeah. You don't ask why you're chopping them, and you certainly don't decide to suddenly bake a cake instead. You handle the ingredients exactly as the owner instructed.
And the crucial piece of that dynamic, the reason it matters so much, is how it dictates the mechanism of legal liability.
Oh, okay.
The legal burden shifts dramatically depending on which role you fall into.
That makes total sense. Because, if a customer gets sick from a bad onion, the health inspector doesn't send the line chef to jail.
Right. The chef just followed orders. They just chopped what was in front of them.
Exactly. The owner's the one who sourced the bad onions. The owner decided to serve them. So the fiduciary carries that ultimate legal liability for consent, purpose, and data quality.
Yeah. And the processor still has duties, obviously. I mean, they have to keep the chopping block clean and secure.
Keep the kitchen safe.
Right. But the overarching compliance burden lands squarely on the fiduciary. The processor is liable for the security of the operation, but the fiduciary is liable for the existence of the operation itself.
That is a great way to put it. Now, once you establish that base identity as the owner, the framework immediately forces another division. It asks whether you are a data fiduciary from the private sector or the public sector.
It does, yeah.
And I have to switch back on that distinction a little bit.
Oh.
Yeah. Why does the framework immediately care if you're government or private enterprise? I mean, does the data care who owns it?
Well,
My name, my address, my biometric data. It's completely identical whether a private shoe company collects it or the Department of Motor Vehicles collects it.
that is true. The data is the same.
So let me guess. Is it because a public sector entity has a monopoly on its services, whereas I can just, choose to buy my shoes somewhere else?
That is precisely the mechanism driving the distinction.
Okay, so I'm on the right track.
You are. The state possesses an inherent coercive power that the private sector simply lacks. I mean, a private sector fiduciary is driven by commercial incentives.
Profit, marketing optimization, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. The risk to the individual is commercial exploitation, sure, but participation is generally voluntary.
Right. You can always opt out of a loyalty program.
Yes. But you cannot opt out of paying praxis.
Oh, good point.
You can't opt out of the census or the justice system. The public sector collects data for governance and law enforcement, and because the citizen has no choice but to hand over their data to the state, the rules of engagement have to be structurally different.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, the oversight mechanisms, the foundational rights, they must be different. The entire trajectory of your compliance assessment splits permanently at this question.
Okay, so let's say you're sitting in your boardroom and you've established your inherent identity. You are, let's say, a private sector data fiduciary. You own a for-profit restaurant.
Right.
You might think the identity crisis is over. But the framework weaves that "who am I" narrative right into the next section. It essentially asks, now that you know what you are, how heavy are you?
It demands to know your scale.
Yeah. It introduces the concept of scale with a very intimidating question. It asks, am I a significant data fiduciary?
And that word significant is key here. It's the threshold where compliance graduates from standard operational hygiene into a heavily audited, highly scrutinized regulatory mandate.
Wow, okay, so what triggers that?
The framework looks at the volume of data you hold, the sensitivity of that data, and interestingly, the potential risk to electoral democracy or public order.
Wow, so it's really evaluating the blast radius.
Exactly.
Like, if a local diner has a data breach, it's unfortunate for a few hundred people. But if a massive multinational food supply chain has a breach, people starve.
Precisely. If you are deemed significant, the blast radius of your failure requires a completely different level of architectural security.
And that blast radius seems to become even more complex when identities start to merge, because the source text introduces a fascinating relational question right here.
It does.
Though I have to point out it uses a very specific phrasing in the notes. It asks, am I a joint data judiciary?
Yes, I saw that.
I noticed that typo in the notes. And it's so funny because later in the text, it refers to joint data fiduciary, which makes perfect sense, like two restaurant owners partnering up.
Right, a joint venture.
But joint data judiciary paints this incredible picture in my head of two corporate executives sitting on a bench in black robes, banging a gavel, and like passing legal judgment on a spreadsheet.
It's a hilarious visual, and while it is almost certainly a typographical error in the drafting, it actually serves as a brilliant accidental metaphor for how shared liability actually functions.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, when two entities become a joint fiduciary, they are, in a very real sense, mutually judging the risk.
Oh, I see. Give me a real-world scenario of how two companies, sit on the bench together and split that liability.
Sure. So imagine two major airlines creating a shared frequent flyer rewards network.
Yeah.
They are pooling their customer databases to offer joint benefits. They are both deciding the purpose of the data collection together.
Right. They're co-owners of that data management.
Exactly. Now, if there is a massive breach of that shared database, the DPDPA doesn't care which airline server was compromised first.
They don't point fingers.
No, they are jointly liable. So behind the scenes, they have to legally judge each other. They must establish complex contractual indemnifications, shared incident response protocols.
That's expensive.
Oh, very. They need designated points of contact for user grievances. They are essentially mutually judging the architecture of their shared risk.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting regarding that shared risk.
Yeah.
Because the framework asks a final relational question in this identity section. It asks, am I a data processor or joint data fiduciary of another significant data fiduciary?
Yes, the relational aspect.
So let's go back to our line shift for a second. Let's say I am a lowly data processor. I just chop the onions. But my client, the owner of the restaurant, is a massive significant data fiduciary.
Okay.
Does their regulatory significance somehow rub off on me? I mean, why does the framework care who my partners are? I'm just a vendor following orders.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, data doesn't exist in a vacuum. The framework operates on the principle of contagious risk.
Contagious risk.
Yes. The compliance burden of a massive entity inherently flows downstream to every single vendor it touches.
Oh, wow. Let me see if I have the mechanics of this right. So if a huge national bank is a significant fiduciary and they outsource their employee payroll to a tiny third-party software vendor, right? That tiny vendor is suddenly pulled into the regulatory gravity of the bank.
Exactly. Because the bank's highly scrutinized compliance mandates are utterly useless if they hand their sensitive data over to a vendor operating out of a basement with zero security protocols.
Well, yeah, that would be a massive loophole.
Precisely. So the framework forces the significant fiduciary to flow their audit rights, their security standards, and all their compliance obligations down through their contracts.
So the small guy can't escape it.
No. The small payroll vendor can't just hide behind the label of processor. If they process data for a giant, they must elevate their internal practices to meet the giant's mandated standards, or the entire ecosystem is compromised.
Man, that is a massive takeaway for our listener to bring up in their meeting. You can't just audit your own internal identity. You literally have to audit the identities of the clients you serve.
Absolutely.
Contagious risk means your compliance budget might triple simply because you signed a new client.
It's true. Your identity is inherently tied to the company you keep. Risk scales up.
Okay, so your inherent identity dictates your base burden, and your scale multiplies it. But the ultimate test of any identity in a legal framework is whether it grants you an escape hatch.
Ah, yes, the exemptions.
Exactly, which is exactly where the framework goes next, the final layer. It asks, what is my exemption status? And honestly, in a boardroom setting, this is the section everyone is waiting for.
Because absolute rigid compliance creates immense economic friction.
Yeah, it's expensive and slow.
Right. Legal frameworks often provide escape hatches to prevent the economy from grinding to a halt under the weight of its own rules.
And the framework divides these escape hatches into two distinct categories, which is honestly a fascinating way to look at the law.
It really is.
First, there are identity-based exemptions, which are based purely on your inherent existence, who you are. It asks things like, am I a notified instrumentality of the state? Or am I a notified startup?
Right. So to categorize those, an instrumentality of the state would be something like a central election commission or a state-run tax authority.
And giving them a modified rule book tracks perfectly with our earlier discussion about the public sector's coercive power.
Exactly. The state writes the rules, so it carves out operational space for itself in the name of national security or public order.
Makes sense. And the startup exemption feels equally pragmatic, though for entirely different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I get why a notified startup might get a break to encourage innovation.
Yeah, you don't want to crush an innovative new company dealing with early-stage venture capital constraints by applying the same crushing regulatory oversight you'd use for a trillion-dollar tech monopoly.
Right, they'd never survive.
Proportional regulation encourages economic growth. You provide the startup with a longer regulatory runway so they can establish themselves before bearing the full weight of compliance.
Okay, I totally buy that. But then the framework introduces the second category, activity-based exemptions.
Yes, situational compliance.
Right, so this isn't about who you are permanently. It's about what you are doing right now in a specific moment. The framework asks, am I processing the personal data for mergers, financial default analysis, and am I processing the personal data of foreigners under a contract?
A very different set of rules.
It feels like a jarring shift. I mean, we went from broad, profound philosophy to hyper-specific corporate carve-outs that look like they were lobbied for by Wall Street.
It does look like a loophole.
Why do specifically mergers and financial default analysis get a free pass from privacy laws?
Well, this raises an important question for the listener to think about. It looks jarring on the surface, but the mechanics of these activities reveal a deep tension between individual privacy rights and systemic economic stability.
Okay, how so?
The framework recognizes that in highly specific, volatile situations, standard compliance would cause catastrophic damage.
Break down the mechanics of financial default analysis for me then. Why does a defaulting company get to bypass data rules?
Okay, consider a major commercial real estate developer that is suddenly collapsing and defaulting on massive loans across multiple banks.
Okay, big financial mess.
Right. The financial institutions need to rapidly analyze vast amounts of personal financial data, cascading debt structures, and vendor payments to prevent a wider market panic or to restructure the assets.
Okay, I'm with you.
Now, the standard DPDPA rule would require the banks to obtain fresh, explicit consent from every single defaulting individual before analyzing that data.
Oh, wow. And obviously, the people defaulting on their loans are not going to enthusiastically give the bank permission to analyze their financial ruin.
Exactly. The compliance requirement would effectively become a legal shield for financial delinquency. The entire system would freeze.
Oh, I see. So they wouldn't be able to fix the problem.
Exactly. Therefore, the framework dictates that in this highly controlled scenario, the necessity of macroeconomic stability overrides the standard requirement for individual privacy consent. You are temporarily shielded.
Okay, that makes perfect sense when you look at the underlying mechanism. What about the carve-out for corporate mergers?
It operates on a very similar logic regarding operational reality. When two massive corporations explore a merger, they must perform deep due diligence.
Right, looking at the books.
Yes. They have to open their data rooms to each other, which inherently involves examining employee compensation data, customer lists, and vendor contracts.
Oh, right. And you can't exactly send an email to 1 million customers asking for consent to share their anonymized data with a prospective buyer without leaking the fact that a highly confidential merger is taking place.
It would be disaster.
It would instantly tank the stock price or trigger massive insider trading.
Exactly. The transaction would be impossible to execute. So the exemption allows the market to function in these highly sensitive edge cases. You are temporarily shielded from standard processing obligations while executing the specific act of the merger.
Wow. Okay. And the final specific activity exemption, processing the personal data of foreigners under a contract, that one seems to be entirely about protecting a domestic outsourcing industry.
Yes, it is a purely macroeconomic calculation. If your country has a massive tech or business processing sector that handles data for European or North American companies, the government does not want to double regulate that data.
Because it would just slow everything down.
Right. The logic is essentially, these are foreign citizens governed by a foreign contract, let the foreign privacy laws handle it. By carving this out, the domestic processing industry avoids a redundant layer of compliance, keeping them globally competitive.
It is incredibly revealing to see the framework transition from an existential identity crisis at the very beginning to such stark, pragmatic economic self-preservation at the end.
It really covers the whole spectrum.
It does. So what does this all mean? For you, our listener, as you organize your notes for this compliance meeting today, we've basically traced the entire architectural logic of the framework.
Yes, we have.
You start by answering the profound question, who am I? You establish your foundational identity. Are you the fiduciary owning the risk or the processor just handling the tools?
Right, the owner versus the chef.
Exactly. Are you operating in the profit-driven private sector or wielding the coercive power of the public sector? And once you know what you are, you have to measure your scale. Are you significant enough to cause a massive blast radius if you fail?
And looking at your relationships.
Right. Are you forming a joint partnership where you must mutually judge risk and share indemnification? Does the contagious regulatory gravity of a massive client pull your small processing firm into strict compliance?
The downstream flow.
Yeah. And finally, you look for the escape hatches. Does your inherent identity as a state agency or an early-stage startup give you a break? Or are you engaging in highly specific volatile economic activities like corporate mergers or systemic default analysis that grant you a temporary situational shield?
That provides a highly effective, logical through line for any boardroom presentation. It really does. But before we conclude, there is a final, somewhat provocative thought to all of this that I'd love to leave the listener with to mull over.
Oh, I'm always here for a provocative thought. Let's hear it.
It builds directly on the rigidity of these classification questions. We've spent this entire discussion establishing that the DPDPA requires you to define exactly who am I in the present moment.
Right now? Today?
Exactly. But modern corporate structures are incredibly fluid. The danger here lies in the assumption that identity is static.
Oh, wow. It's the classic ship of Theseus paradox.
Precisely.
If you slowly replace every wooden board on a ship, is it still the same ship?
Yeah.
If a company slowly changes its data practices, is it still the same entity under the law?
And the legal framework certainly doesn't think so. Imagine you are a standard private sector fiduciary, you've done your assessment, and you are totally compliant.
Okay, feeling good.
Then, overnight, your engineering team launches a new AI product feature that suddenly ingests millions of new data points. You unknowingly cross the invisible volume threshold and become a significant data fiduciary.
Oh, man. And the government doesn't send you a notification saying, congratulations, you are now significant.
No, they absolutely do not. Or consider the notified startup. You are enjoying your regulatory exemptions, but then you close a massive Series C funding round and scale out of that category.
You lose your exemption.
Instantly. Or your boutique analytics firm signs a contract to process data for a massive national bank, immediately pulling you into their contagious risk ecosystem. Your identity, and therefore your entire legal reality, shifts in the time it takes to sign a contract.
That is wild, because the framework demands absolute self-awareness, but businesses are constantly evolving. How fast can a company realize its own identity has changed before the regulators catch up with them?
That's the million-dollar question.
Because the exact second your data practices shift, your previous painstakingly documented compliance assessment isn't just outdated. It becomes documented proof of your current legal liability.
Exactly. Compliance in this framework is not a destination you reach and just forget about. It is a continuous, active state of self-awareness. The moment you stop asking the question, you are out of compliance.
That is an incredibly powerful mechanism to bring up in your meeting. It is not enough to answer, "Who am I today?" You have to build a system that constantly asks that question every single time the business makes a strategic move. You have to monitor your own evolution.
You really do.
Well, we want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the DPDPA assessment and classification framework. We hope you feel armed, ready, and intellectually prepared for that boardroom.
Absolutely. Good luck out there.
Just remember, when they pull up the first slide and everyone in the room is bracing for a clinical wall of legal jargon, you can be the one to lean forward, bypass the technicalities, and start the discussion with the most important question in the room. Who am I? Good luck in there.